What's up, y'all? I'm George Kors, and today I've got a very special deep dive for the channel. As you may have noticed on the channel, I do talk quite a bit about German literature, and I read in the original German, so I wanted to do a deep dive into the German literary traditions for folks. Because if you're interested in reading more German literature, I wanted to give you a place to start. Now, most of what I'm going to talk about today is in translation in English. There's just one item on my list that I know is not translated into English. I can't speak for other languages. If you're hoping to read in the French or the Arabic or the Chinese, for example, I do not know what of these texts are translated. I'd presume a pretty good portion, though. So if you are interested out there in getting more into German literature, I hope this is a good starting place for you. I was very lucky when I was a teenager to get a scholarship to participate in the Congress Bundestag Youth Exchange Program. So this meant I spent a year of high school at a gymnasium in Brandenburg, outside of Berlin. And there, I was introduced to literature. And this was a huge moment in my life that has changed me forever. Because having been introduced to literature by the faculty there, very seriously so, and with the faculty treating all of us students with such intellectual seriousness, changed who I was and what I wanted to be, and it solidified in me the desire to be a novelist, like I am today, and it led me on the path of being a professor and a librarian, and working in academia here in the United States. And I have the faculty there at Gottfried Arnold Gymnasium to thank for that. And, generally, I think that there's a lot of really great and really highly relevant German literature that might go unexplored by folks in the United States. So I'm hoping that this video is a great resource for you. I hope it is. If you like it, like and subscribe below and comment. Let me know what you're going to read from this. I'm going to try and go in roughly chronological order. The timeline's going to be a little all over the place, but I'm going to try and loosely go in chronological order and introduce you to a variety of those literary movements and of have discussion of various authors and writers and artists that I think might be of interest to folks. So let's get started. The first one, bear with me, is a little trite and cliched. I've got other material that we're going to get into here, but it's mega classic, and we've got to talk about it, and that is Goethe's Faust, Der Tragödie erster Teil, the part one of the tragedy. You may know the Faustian tradition, talking about the deal with the devil sort of action. Goethe's Faust, what Goethe was doing with this is a major part of the Faustian tradition. So if you have read a book like Master and Margarita by Miguel Bulgakov, for example, then you have seen the let's say influences of Goethe's Faust. And I think that the part one, this is very widely translated and read. And I will just say this: just keep an eye out when you're reading. For those of us who are reading in translation here, because there's multiple parts to Goethe's Faust. You'll see in my fancier edition here, there's two parts, and then there's also Urfaust, which is Faust in the original, and that was then heavily edited and changed to be Faust the first part. So just a heads up, when people are talking about Goethe's Faust, they are almost very likely talking about part one, which is very famous. And this is a stage play that is written in verse. And for those of us who are reading it in the original, the stage play being written in this rhyming verse, this A-B structure, which very frequently comes forward in here in terms of the rhyme. This is quite the literary achievement. And also, a little bonus, this was my movie ticket I was using to go see The Lives of the Others when it came out in theaters back there. That's also, my German friends are going to be like, oh, Wittenberger. And so that was in the area of where I was studying. But yeah, so I think Goethe is a real classic. I folks on the channel know that I try to stay away from calling something the classics. I think it's kind of a nebulous term. But I think this is a worthy start for sure. And I think that there's also, this is kind of a cliched text in the sense of its treatment of gender roles. To be sure, now it is old. This is an old text from the 18th century, my friend. So there is that. But also, I think if you are interested in something like that, looking at Goethe's Faust through the lens of gender roles and gender studies might be a provocative thing that might shed some light on that deal with the devil stuff. So something to think about there. The next sort of older read that I'm going to recommend, it was outside of reading Goethe's Faust when I was a teen in Brandenburg. This was the major literary moment for me, which is Heinrich Heine's Deutschland ein Wintermärchen, Germany a Winter's Tale. And this is translated, and I know that this is also, this and Goethe's Faust, for example, both of these are available in like Project Gutenberg, so you can read these for free. And this is another poem. This is not a stage play, but this is just a regular poem that is also written in verse. And the themes here that Heine deals with when it comes to sort of discussions, particularly of exile, which come up a lot, are really near and dear to me. And this was the item right here. This was the work that made me want to write, that made me want to talk it out, because Heinrich Heine, the main action of this poem is that he journeys back to he travels back to Germany to visit his mother, and he is in political exile. And in unpacking that, it is just really beautiful, and also Heine has a lot to say about exile and otherness, and how we deal with being othered, and also there's quite a bit of queerness that we could read into here as well. Heinrich Heine, I think, is a poet that ought to be that more folks ought to be talking about more widely. I know folks might. I'm not going to talk about Rilke today, but folks might be really interested in Rilke. But Heine is really quite excellent, and I actually have the collected works of Heine that I got, which this is a near and dear to me, that has a lot of material in here. And I very rarely buy something like this, but this was, I could not resist this the last time I was in Berlin. I saw this. So I think Heine is one of those figures that I just really has a lot of light to shine on the world, and would be really important for us to consider reading. Yeah, so excellent. So those two classics that I think you might get into if you're interested in verse, if you're interested in theater productions, and there's some other theater productions we're going to talk about as well. But I think, that is a great starting point for some of our folks who might be interested in something that's a little on the older side, and has a little bit of those sensibilities. Moving more contemporarily, getting us closer to a more contemporary space. A couple of the folks that I would want to talk about would be specifically Franz Kafka and Thomas Mann. Now, I think that these are two literary figures that pretty much everybody is going to be familiar with. But I do think, taking a look at the earlier Thomas Mann novel, Buddenbrooks, which is, this is what it's also titled in the English, which is about a sort of multi-generational family and their downfall. I think this also is sort of to me, beginning of that German modernist literary tradition that really flourishes in the in-between wartime, but this was published pre-World War I, and really sort of delves into that perspective of, the 1848 revolutions and beyond. Now, Heinrich Heine is part of this 1848 movement and this political uproar in the 19th century. We also see some politics in something like Goethe's Faust, of course, but Thomas Mann and Buddenbrooks really shows this sort of generational progression of politics, which is the political is inseparable from the art in most German literary traditions. You cannot separate the two of them out. I know a lot of my American readers might be inclined to say, "Oh, hey, well, I don't like political stuff." That is impossible, and it is particularly in the context of a lot of German, and in my opinion, in German literary traditions, an impossible feat to separate the politics from the art. And Thomas Mann's Buddenbrooks is the first novel that got him famous, and also I think just the way that it captures a lot of the politics of the country before the First World War is really remarkable. The other novel that I'm going to recommend here, which is just now 100 years old, is The Magic Mountain, Der Zauberberg, by Thomas Mann. Another deeply political novel, but this is a coming of age work. I've done a video on this one, and this, you don't read a lot of coming of age novels like this. It's almost 1,000 pages in length. It's very long. And there's a lot of allegorical characters in here that represent various political movements and philosophies and ideas. And I think this, again, is a really, really remarkable work. This is one of those interwar period works coming out in 1924 that I think is really, really remarkable. And I think a lot of American readers might find this rather boring. Hans Castorp's narrative is primarily centered on his being at a sanitarium, and a lot of the action is discussions between different characters about politics, morals, ethics, philosophy, and so on. Now, I don't think it's boring at all. In fact, I think that this is a remarkable work, and this might be one of the most remarkable coming of age stories ever authored in any language, let alone the German one. And I think it is well worth your time to sort of look at Hans Castorp's journey and behold how complicated he sees the world as he is coming of age as a young person in the lead up to the First World War. And I think the way Thomas Mann's treatment is very, very elegant. There's also a Thomas Mann novel that I have a copy of. I just don't have it with me right at the moment. That's called Dr. Faustus. That is in the Faust tradition. So if you are into Goethe's Faust, you could read the story of Adrian Leverkühn, which is a really beautiful novel that Thomas Mann did after the Second World War about descent into madness and a deal with the devil there. So moving on to Kafka, Kafka is a complicated person to read. And if you have seen my video on the castle, you will know that there's quite a bit going on when it comes to reading Kafka. That is something that we as readers need to do in terms of assessing the ethics of reading this man. And now I have two novels here that I'm going to recommend that are sort of spoken about sometimes together, which is The Castle, Das Schloss, and Der Prozess, The Trial. These two novels tend to be spoken about in the same breath, and the reason is that they are very thematically related. There's no doubt about it that reading both of them is definitely a worthy task. And why I would say that is both of them approach isolation, loneliness, and bureaucracy and the dealings with complicated, almost otherworldly power in similar ways. And I think both of them are very worthwhile. If you have heard good things about Kafka, maybe you've read a couple short stories, I think delving into the novels would be a great thing. Now, here's the complicated part of this. That our folks who are reading in translation and our folks who are reading in the original German are going to have to deal with, which is that both of these novels are left unfinished for the most part, the Castle particularly, and depending upon your translation, Max Brod did, when initially publishing Kafka's work after his death, against his wishes, did take significant editorial power with them. So, depending upon the translation you read of The Castle in particular, you might have a different experience than from one translation to another. And that is just one thing that we need to think about. Another thing with Kafka, and I speak at length about this in my video on The Castle, is that we need to think about what is ethical when it comes to reading Kafka. I see time and time again on socials I see folks talking about Kafka's journals, Kafka's letters, all in translation. I know a lot of this stuff was recently translated. Um, and a lot of the Kafka short stories collections that I have, in addition to this copy of The Castle, reflect what the material looked like in his journals. Some of those collections that are short story collections also have like the personal anecdotes or the letters intermingled with them if they appeared that way in the original journal or text. And that is something that you as a reader should be pushing yourself to think about the ethics of. Kafka did not wish to share his material. Max Brod went against his wishes and did not destroy his literary work afterwards, after his death. And that is something for us to think about. That is something for us to strongly consider when we are reading, even the novels, but especially something like the letters. We do need to think about the artists, their intentions, because there's a lot going on there, and Kafka is a confounding figure in the literary tradition because of it. Another thing that I'll say about Kafka that just like when we're reading Heinrich Heine or Goethe, and we're reading this in verse, and it's got a particular sensibility to it. Kafka's language in the original is very particular, and the way that he uses punctuation in some of his sentences are very particular, and they are very unique. His style is really singular in and of himself. That is something that is another sort of layer for us to add to Kafka, and it might be, if you are studying the German language, it might be worth considering reading Kafka in the original to experience a little bit of how that original language works. And I know translation is something that is really important to a video like this, because you want to make sure your translations are good and representative of what it is that you're reading. And it's something that if you are getting into these in the English or in the French or in the Arabic or in the Chinese, for example, maybe you're a Spanish speaker, it is worth your time to do a little bit of homework on which translation you want to read, because I do think that will shape some of your experiences. And particularly with Kafka, I do think that you do need to be mindful, at least, of which translations you're referring to. It's a major part of what I think consuming Kafka ethically is considering which translations to read. Continuing on with this interwar period, this sort of modernist period from World War I into the interwar period here, there's a couple of interwar period novels that I want to highlight. One is not translated, the other is translated, and we'll start with the translated one first. And this is going to be Berlin Alexanderplatz by Alfred Döblin. Döblin and Berlin Alexanderplatz are a big influence on Roberto Bolaño. So if you have been reading Roberto Bolaño, I really encourage you to read this. And I do love the artwork here. But this Berlin Alexanderplatz, when it comes to discussions of the Weimar era German political situation, I do think that this is a really, really essential novel, and it's definitely one of those that's really important for you to read. Franz Bieberkopf is a really complicated character, and there's a ton going on here, and I think that this is one of those situations where, politically, we owe it to ourselves to delve in deeply into what's going on here in this interwar period and the rise of the Third Reich, for example. And I think Döblin and Alexanderplatz is one really, really essential place for us to dig deep, for sure. Also, this is translated into the English, I know for sure. The work that is not translated, that I hear rumors is potentially going to receive a translation, but I cannot confirm that, is Perugia by Hans Jennejan. So this is for folks who are reading in the original. Right now, this is a really, really fantastic work that is heavily influenced by James Joyce's Ulysses, and Hans Jennejan has some very, very experimental style wise and narrative wise material in here that I think is just really, really fantastic. Jennejan Hennian, sorry, is a literary figure that I think deserves translation for sure. And I also think that he deserves a little bit more attention when it comes to queer authors in the German tradition. Thomas Mann, likewise, as a bi author, I think deserves a little bit more attention, especially in a novel like Magic Mountain that I was talking about earlier, for his exploration of queerness. But Henny Jan, as a queer author, I think deserves a lot of our attention. And if you see, if you are an experimental fiction fan, and you see, if we see a translation come out of this, it is very, very well worth your time, and should be at the top of your list, to be sure, in this interwar period. One next interwar period person who I'm going to highlight here, who also is writing after the Second World War, that I think would be important for folks to consider, would be Bertolt Brecht. This is the Drei Groschen Oper, Threepenny Opera, a very famous production. Brecht's literary output is huge, and really important, and one of the reasons why I think Brecht not only is important for us to consider, just from the interwar period, but also because Brecht eventually does live in the DDR, lives in the German Democratic Republic in Eastern Germany. And I think that this is a good, Brecht as a socialist is a good primer for us, to prepare for reading Eastern German literature. Threepenny Opera is deeply political. All of these works are deeply political, of course, as I've said. But, I think we do owe Brecht a good reading. And also, Threepenny Opera is very famous. This is translated. If you're able to find some of Brecht's poems in translation, particularly his poems around the Stunde Null, or the 0 hour movement, this Stunde Null is a reference to the 0 hour. This is when the Second World War ends. And let me actually pull that up for you folks. There we go. I've got this here, this Stunde Null. And this is a literary movement that I think is really important for us to consider here. This 0 hour, 0 hour movement talks about the culture this cultural moment that happens at the end of the Second World War. And you have to imagine this total war culture that's happening in the Second World War. And at that, 0 hour, when the war ends, this is a huge pivotal moment in German, not only history, but also in German art. And this collection here is really, really worth your while. If you are in speaking and reading in the original German, I would recommend Die Stunde Null in der deutschen Literatur. And I think, Brecht also has some really fantastic 0 hour stuff. And then also transitions into that Eastern German tradition of literature as well. So there's definitely a lot to think of there. Now, in this post-war era here, there's some more stuff that I want to get into. But I want to talk now, because we just talked about Bertolt Brecht, about Eastern German literature. And this is something that I'm always, because I lived in former Eastern Germany, this is something that I'm always trying to read more of, trying as best I can to get more literature out of those Eastern Germans. And that is a tough task. It's difficult for me to find German literature in the United States, to say the least. But there's a standout author that I really want to encourage everybody to read. And that is Christa Wolf. Christa Wolf, to my mind, has some of the best representations of German literature out there. Was a genius in her own right, and wrote some really powerful, and politically complicated works. And the two that I'm going to recommend here are definitely big deals. The first one is The Divided Sky, by Christa Wolf, and in this is a love story in part, but also this is a tale of two lovers, one of whom in the beginning, in the building of the wall, moves to Western Germany, moves to West Berlin, and leaves his lover behind in Eastern Germany. And this novel is a good representation, in my opinion, of socialist realism, which is a movement that's happening in Eastern Germany and other Soviet aligned states. Um, and I think it also just generally is a good, very thoughtful depiction of how that political split between Eastern and Western Germany works itself out, and how it affects the day to day lives of individuals. So I think The Divided Sky is definitely a very um, worthwhile read for folks. And then the second of Woolf's works that I would recommend is Cassandra, which is political in a very different way, written much later. And we know Cassandra, the Greek figure, prophetic but not believed by those around her. And this rewrite is deeply psychological, and it's very fraught because it is commenting on, uh, you know, uh, like the Stasi presence in a lot of Eastern German life. So I think that this is so almost like prophetic towards the downfall of the Eastern German state. And I think that this novel, Cassandra, for my taste, in my opinion, I think this novel by Christa Wolf needs to be read by way more people than it is. Christa Wolf in general was panned in a very sexist manner after the fall of the wall, for having written socialist realist literature, and was not treated well after the fall of the wall. And in my opinion, that was you know I think she deserves so much more than that, and definitely deserves our attention. And as an Eastern German author, Christa Wolf definitely stands out for me. There's a second author here that I'd recommend that sort of bridges the gap between Eastern and Western Germany and has quite a bit to say about both, and that is Uwe Johnson. And Uwe Johnson wrote this extremely long series. It's almost like 2,000 pages long, called Jahrestage, or Anniversaries. Anniversaries has just recently, as of like 2018, in the last 10 years, been translated into the English in its complete form. It was abridged before that. So if you're reading this in English, keep an eye out, because you might be holding on to an abridged edition of it. This is just part one of four here, and this also speaks to how experimental the German novel can be, because this is the form here is as a almost like journal like entries, that goes back and forth between these journal entries, commentary on the New York Times, and the explaining of a family history to a child. So Gesine Crespal is the protagonist here, and she's an Eastern German woman who is living in New York City. And she is trying to get used to American culture by reading, the newspaper, by reading the New York Times, and she's educating her child, Maria, on her family history. And this series, Jahrestage, if you're interested in really long family sagas, I think this is right up your alley. This is one of those novels that is so granular, so detailed. There's so much going on in here. It is experimental in its narration, to be sure, and I think in my opinion, it really, for an outsider, for those of us who weren't living in Germany at the time when it was divided, this really does show the sort of overlap and intersectionality between those Eastern and Western cultural traditions. So yeah, anniversary is definitely a big one for us to think about. There's another. So speaking of our post-war experimental, I think Christa Wolf and Uwe Johnson do a fantastic job at getting us into that sort of position. But there is one author who I think, in my opinion, is talking about the Second World War from a Western German perspective, although um, had fled into Western Germany, and I think the the tin drum, the Blechtrommel, to me doesn't necessarily represent Eastern or Western Germany very well, but it does represent to me a little bit of the absurdity leading up to that Stunde Null moment, to that 0 hour moment that I was speaking about just a few minutes ago. Particularly, I think this is interesting because this has a lot of magical realist sensibilities. We follow Oscar Mazerat, who is a child that refuses to grow up, and his magical tin drum as they live in Danzig throughout the rise of the Nazis. And Gunter Grass, being controversial later in life is its own thing, but I think the tin drum. This is a really really famous work, and for good reason, because I think the way that it approaches the sort of psychology and mentality of the rise of Nazism is really provocative and interesting, and I think it participates in that magical realist movement that was happening a lot in the 1970s and 80s in a big way. Um, so this is another sort of experimental novel that I think I would recommend to folks, and it's also quite long. It's over 700 pages. So this is a big one as well. Um, Moving on here, before I get to more contemporary stuff, I want to talk about the biggest novel that I have here, and I've got to scoot some stuff out of the way here, so that way we can talk about this, um, which is, you know, Arno Schmidt and Zettelstraum. This is an important work of fiction for the Germans, but I have, before I open up the novel and I start showing folks how this looks, and you'll see I'm getting ready here because of how big it is. I have to ask the publishers, Schurkamp and S. Fischer Verlag, again. I've been asking this for years. I got into an argument with folks from S. Fischer Verlag on Twitter about this over a decade ago. I got to ask to please publish a smaller version of this novel, something that can be held in your hands that you can scribble in. You cannot find a copy of Zettel's Traum or Bottom's Dream, as it's translated in English, for less than 200 euros. They are all gigantic. It is gatekeeping to the fullest, and I understand how precious this novel of Arno Schmidt's is. But please, if we can have Finnegan's Wake in a used bookstore for $3, please give us a copy of Zettel's Traum. If anything, if you are watching this, please join me in my fight for a smaller and more accessible edition of this novel, because it does deserve to be read as widely as possible. And I think that there are other literary folks like myself out there that know and experience this novel, but just because of how large it is, how heavy it is, and how expensive it is, few people are really even taking a look at this. So let's get in here and look at one of the most experimental German novels ever written, which is Zettelstraum by Arno Schmidt. I've got to kind of finagle this thing out here. It is really, really huge. It weighs probably 20 or 30 pounds. It is beautiful. And let me just open it and let you take a look at, just a random page in here. You see how particular this text looks in here. You see how exact it is. And they, to the credit to the publishers, they've done a fantastic job of actually getting Zettelstraum onto the page in the way that was possibly exactly intended by the author. But, and I'm trying to just do this in a way that, but, this is something that could be in a smaller edition. Something that you might also want to annotate. This is the kind of work that perhaps I might be interested in scribbling all over, or looking up to the various references and ideas here. And to say, just lifting it up, I mean, this thing is, it's the size of my chest. And to say that this is one of the most important experimental novels ever written is true. But imagine if you had to buy Finnegan's Wake in this size. So if you have the means, if your university library has this, they might have it in the English as Bottom's Dream. I don't know how much more widely it's translated other than that. Or if you have the money to splurge on something like this, by all means. But this is a novel that I'm hoping in my lifetime receives the treatment of being sold in a paperback, and I think it absolutely can. And I'll just say, to my German publishing friends out there, please do the work of making Settles Traum more accessible. We readers are looking forward to it. And I know that a lot of Americans, since the publishing of the translation, are really interested in this. So this is a crazy experimental novel. I definitely don't know that I expect a lot of folks to be able to read Settles Traum, or even get access to it. Just considering how huge it is, you see, I'm struggling even just to put this in its container here. Let me see if I can get it in here. So if you have connections over at S. Fischer Verlag or Surkamp Verlag, please send them to my channel. Send them to me. I want to talk to them about this. I have been trying, pleading for years with no luck to get a more holdable version of that. And that brings me to what's up next, which is some more contemporary stuff. Something from the 1980s that I want to talk about. An Austrian author is Elfriede Jelinek, and Die Klavierspielerin, or The Piano Player. This novel has seen treatment as a film. Also is translated as well as The Piano Player. And also, I believe Jelinek not only won the Georg Büchner Prize, but I think won the Nobel. And this is a really harrowing read, a deeply emotional and at times shocking read that I think is well worth everybody's time. And I think it's a very provocative narrative here. And I think that this came out. I want to say this came out in the 1980s. I would have to look and see when this was published, but yes, I think, 1983, I believe, is when this came out. So we're getting a little bit more contemporary here with The Piano Player, which brings me to the last novel that I have that I want to recommend, which is a much more contemporary work by Shida Bazyar, which is Drei Kameradinnen. And there's a lot of you see, I love this cover, how like iridescent it is. This novel is recently translated in the English, and I do believe that it is available in the United Kingdom. Now, I'm sure that if you were living in the United States, that you could buy this as well. But Shida Bazyar and a lot of contemporary novelists in Germany are dealing with a lot of the intersectionality between Turkish and Muslim and German and Christian cultures. And I think that Drei Kameraden does a really great job of delving into that. And, pardon me, one of the things that I love that the narration does here is it addresses the audience using that like second person and third person you, and I really, really like that. And I thought that was really impressive. And I think Shida Bazyar just does a really great job in this novel. It's really political. It's really sharp, and it's really critical. And this, I think, is a good representation of a lot of what like contemporary German literature is out there. And like I said, all of this is political. All of these items are political. And I do think that the German literary tradition in and of itself, outside of its subgenres, is one of the most highly political out there, given obviously German history, but also just the intersectionality of a place like Germany, having Eastern and Western Germany, having them unite, having huge populations of folks from Turkey, having huge populations of folks from Eastern Europe. Germany is really at a crossroads, and a lot of its literature sort of represents that in a really provocative way that I think is really, really important. So overall, I hope that you found some material here that can be helpful to you in your reading practice, or maybe you found some material that's interesting to you. you know, there's so much more than what I listed. I mean, this is such a short listing that I have here that I really think, it is worth your while to dig in and see, if you're interested in seeing what's out there with German literature, take a look. There's a lot more than just Goethe's Faust out there. And, items like this and items like, Buddenbrooks and the castle, for example, that we may know, or Tin Drum that we may know, are of course very important. But there's a ton out there. I think for my folks who are interested in really contemporary literature that looks at intersectionality, I think somebody like Shida Bazyar is definitely right up your alley. And that's definitely something that's really really interesting. Um, and then I think if you're interested in delving into a little bit of that Eastern German literature, Christa Wolf, you cannot go wrong with. I just think as an author and novelist, she did such a fantastic job. Um, and then we have our significant experimentalists like Arno Schmidt out there, and I really I think that there's a lot to be said for just picking what your flavor and going after it and seeing what you can get here. And if you are reading in the original and you're trying, and it's difficult, maybe if German's not your first language, that's okay. Don't give up. Give it a shot. It can be intimidating, of course, but don't hesitate to attempt to delve into that in the original. And that's not to diminish reading in the translation. If you're out there, attempting to read in translation, is very worthwhile. All that I recommend, especially when we're dealing with stuff like Kafka, but all broadly with translation, is attempting to make sure that you know the who, what, when, where, why of that translation. Really thinking about where the translation is coming from, who's paying for it, and what the goal of the translation is key. You know, the translation of Bottom's Dream. This is a university text. This is something that is intended for scholars. Even though I think Settel's Traum and Bottom's Dream could absolutely, without a doubt, be really popular experimental fiction, just for everybody. So lots to think about. I hope that you found something here. Let me know in the comments below if you found anything that you're going to attempt to read or that you're excited to read. And if you've read any of these novels, tell me your thoughts. I'm very always excited to hear. And I want to thank you all so much for spending some time with German literature with me today. And I hope you have a wonderful day. If you want to know more about me as a writer, you can visit georgekors.com or follow me on socials at gbk7288. And thank you so much for your time. Have a great day, everybody.